This edition of the Female Stoic podcast is entitled The Power of Stoic Silence. As you know, every week we have a journal task, so if you have your journal with you, good news. If you don't, catch up with the podcast where you hear podcasts later on in the week. You can go back to this for the journal exercise then. Also, take a look, if you haven't already, at my journaling course. So, the question of the day is, when did you act when it would have been more pertinent to stay quiet? And we are looking, as a classic example of this, at Anne Bronte's Helen Huntingdon in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. And a thought for the day: the moment we accept we are the problem, then we accept we are the solution, which in itself is empowering. So let's have a look at Anne Bronte. Anne Bronte was the youngest of the Bronte children. She wrote Tenant of Wildfell Hall and Agnes Grey before she died at the tender age of 31. She saw the demise of her brother Branwell due to alcoholism, which led to his premature death in the same year at the age of 32. Emily died of consumption. That was another sister, and Anne, I apologise, a year later than Emily and her brother. The younger sisters, as we know, Maria and Elizabeth, died years before from TB. So everyone was either dying, dropping of consumption or TB. It wasn't an easy time to be alive. And Anne, having seen her brother and her sister die in the same year, became consumed with the same illness and finally succumbed to it a year later. The two eldest sisters, Maria and Elizabeth, contracted TB from a particularly harsh boarding school. Quick reference there to my beloved Jane Eyre. Of course, Charlotte, and she lived on to the year 1855. So although she was the oldest daughter of the three that wrote and her brother, she managed to live on. So let's look at The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, a novel about a mysterious young woman, Helen Graham, who she's called herself now. She moves into Wildfell Hall with her son to escape an abusive and alcoholic husband, Arthur Huntingdon. This was written in the 19th century. She begins a friendship with local farmer Gilbert Markham, who's initially puzzled by her secrecy and her reputation. Obviously, people will gossip. But Helen eventually reveals the truth of her past and her husband's cruelty by giving Gilbert her diary, which details their disastrous marriage and her efforts to protect her son. After her husband's death, Helen is reunited with Gilbert and they eventually marry. If you haven't heard the story, check out the playlist, Tenant of Wildfell Hall, on my premium tracks, and the remastered audiobook that is now available, and you will be entranced. It's a wonderful story. It's a story of hope and victory. So it was controversial at the time because obviously it's detailing alcoholism. And of course, Anne had first-hand experience of that through watching the demise of her brother Branwell. When she was alive, after it was first published, Charlotte actually prevented it from republication for several years because she felt the subject matter of alcoholism and marital abuse was too dark and not in line with Anne's retiring personality. So she waited until 1854, after Anne's death, to have it published again. So why Stoic silence? And of course, my favourite phrase, the power of the pause. Well, it is so beautifully depicted in this novel. Firstly, let's have a look at the narrative strategy. So Anne's narrative strategy provides us, the reader, with the opportunity to see the heroine healed before we become absorbed in her own history. We meet her as someone in the beginning who has escaped, who has risen victorious, who has her free will come to fruition. We see her for the first time when most of her troubles are over. So there's a detachment, there's a pause between the horror and what's happening now. We see the awful times as an external event rather than participating in the beginning as bystanders. So this idea that we are detached from what's happening in real time means that the suspense of what's happening doesn't prevent us from concentrating on the significance of her victory. It's a horrific account, but it's an account nevertheless read after the fact through the diary that Helen gives to Gilbert Markham. This is not happening in real time. It allows us a pause, a distance, a moment of silence between what has happened and what is happening now. Allowing time for reflection. It's an epistolary narrative. That means it is read through letters, through first-hand accounts, through Helen's diary, which enables us to gain insight into her thoughts, her feelings, through her own voice. But it creates this space so that we can digest this content in our own way, in our own time. We know that Helen survives. We know she's okay now. So in some sense, this is a kindness from Anne Bronte. It's allowing us to say, okay, well, you've made all good right in the beginning. It's kind of back to front in that way. But now you are going to introduce us to the horrific story behind the heroine who sits in front of us in the first pages. So there's a space between the event and the narration of it. And it's related, as we know, in diary form. So let's have a look at the character of Helen Huntingdon. She is a Stoic character. She's complex, she's strong-willed, devout, and determined. Initially known as Helen Graham, she flees her husband to protect their son. And she does this quietly. She plans it meticulously. She doesn't shout and scream. She doesn't rail against the injustice. He's a horrible man. Because she understands, though, the character he is, if she were to confront him, it would only fuel his fire, fuel his aggression, fuel his hatred. It would be fruitless to challenge him. So there's no emotional blackmail from her side. She takes silent action. She creates a distance between his actions and her reaction to it. She remains stoic whilst all the while she's planning her escape. So again, this novel is about her triumph, her silent triumph over adversity. We're not just talking about the emotional and psychological neglect she suffered, although this was the popular thought of those who railed against it at the time it was published, this idea that we shouldn't be talking about these horrific things. And you're almost debasing, challenging the value of a man in a marital setting. This is about a commitment to Stoic survival through the protection of Helen Graham's inner peace. That's what I take from the novel anyway. And Helen keeps her walls high. She maintains her virtue, even when there appears to be an easy way out in the form of Walter Hargrave, who is one of her husband's friends. So he has friends. He's completely out of control, and some of his friends realise this is not healthy, and he is abusing his wife. And one of them steps into the breach, Walter Hargrave. He's attracted to Helen. He tries to convince her to become his lover, and eventually his wife, arguing that Arthur's neglect and infidelity free her from her marriage vows. But Helen is set up by Anne Bronte as a woman of strong moral and religious principles. She understands who she is. She has a clear idea of her own inner virtue, and she protects that. She repeatedly rebuffs Walter's advances, and she makes her position clear. She was still legally and morally married as long as Arthur was alive. So that would have been an easier way out. What she's doing is saying, I'm not going to compromise who I am, even though now I'm in this disastrous situation, but I'm going to plan quietly, silently, a way out. And Anne is carefully manipulating this sense of narrative silence to focus the reader's attention on the manner in which male authority shapes women's lives. So narrative silence is the intentional use of an absence of sound or dialogue to convey meaning in a story. We see many times Arthur verbally attacking Helen, but she doesn't reply. She doesn't react. This is a powerful narrative device used to create tension, emphasize a character's emotional state or inner thoughts. The more silence, the more we understand that she is suffering. And this in itself is evoking a deep emotional response from us. We don't need her to shout and scream to realize how terrible it is. In fact, the more silent she becomes, the more we understand the struggle she has to maintain her inner peace. The power is in the pause, again, this stoic silence. And it seems, poor woman, that everybody's seeking a reaction from her. So we've even got Gilbert Markham coming in at the end, and of course in the beginning when we first are introduced to Helen. He's seeking reactivity just as much as Arthur Huntingdon, just as much as Walter Hargrave. He wants acknowledgement. He wants control, even though Gilbert Markham is seeking control of the ability to protect her. Huntingdon is seeking control over her herself. Walter Hargrave is seeking control from an egotistical point of view. Well, I'm interested in you, so shouldn't you do what I want? So Helen understands that she has ways out, she has choices, but these choices are actually the choices of other characters. And because she's such a strong character, she knows if she allows herself, she can remain committed to her inner virtue and still survive. And that's the power of this novel, her inner commitment to herself and the power of stoic silence. The lack of reactivity from Helen, the space she creates between herself and the other characters in order to formulate who she really is and understand that her inner virtue is the only thing she has control over. This stoic silence shows emotion. It creates emphasis. It reveals her character. Even though she's being silent, her character is revealed through that. If a character fails to speak their desires, inner conflict or tensions out loud, it doesn't mean they're not existing, they're non-existent. It means they're very, very real. And the temptation is always just to explain ourselves, be answerable in some way. But why? If Helen were to do that, would that help her maintain her inner peace? No, it wouldn't. And this silence can draw attention to what is not being said, whether it's, in the case of this novel, societal constraints, a character's hidden thoughts, or the subtext of a conversation. If we juxtapose the loudness of one character, the enormity of their arrogance and insult, with a silence, a quiet moment from another character, we can enhance the inner turmoil of that character. And moving away from the literature now into our own lives, how do we relate this into our own lives? Well, this Stoic silence is a practice of strategic and purposeful quietude that we use to cultivate self-control, to preserve our inner peace and promote reflection rather than reacting impulsively. If we choose not to speak or get drawn into unnecessary conflict by remaining quiet, for example, during a heated argument, we have the space to work on personal goals. We have the space to further understand who we are and protect ourselves without seeking external validation. So how do we do this? Let's have a look at the journal task for today. So here's our journal, and we're going to write in today's question, which is, when did we act when it would have been more pertinent to stay quiet? Think of a time you acted when, in fact, it didn't benefit you in any way whatsoever, and you would have benefited more by staying quiet. Again, thought for the day, the moment we accept we're the problem, we accept we are also the solution. So that empowers us, that gives us the ultimate control. If I do this, I choose that that will happen to me. If I refuse to react or do this, then I choose that that will not happen to me. So in conflict, how does this work? When we, for example, acted in an argument, instead of jumping to a conclusion or immediately biting back at a comment that's been made to incite us to that behaviour, because that's what people do, we say, okay, I'm just going to create this pause between your behaviour and my reaction. We can choose silence to avoid escalating the situation, to maintain our dignity and our calm. And this pause creates the space for clarity, to understand and gain an understanding of what's going on. And if there's too much noise, the quieter we become. That is the inner strength. Have you ever looked upon somebody who appears very quiet in a crazy situation? Most times, they're not just protecting their inner peace, but they are allowing themselves the space in order to be able to understand how to react, how to respond, how to cope. It's a powerful move, and we need those strategic moves in our lives in order to cope. This is Stoic survival. Okay, so speak only when necessary and in a few words. We're prioritising substance over constant chatter. And this also applies to internal chatter. We're using silence to focus on self-mastery and personal goals rather than seeking external approval. So rather than having to say, I did this today, that happened to me today, I managed this was achieved by me. Focus more, seek external approval less. We might be silent among strangers to avoid idle gossip. Engaging in quiet conversation, meaningful conversation. And why? Why do we do this? Why do we avoid the gossip? Why do we avoid the idle chatter? Because we're building self-control. This is a form of discipline that prevents impulsive reactions. Helen in the tenant of Wildfell Hall is disciplined. And this silence allows for her introspection, which is a great example to us. Gives us time to evaluate our thoughts and potential actions before reacting. It's breaking the cycle of reactive words that can escalate arguments. So to go back to the journal task, when was a time we reacted when it would have been more pertinent to stay quiet? What did we learn from that? This is a reflective journal exercise, looking back on something we did we might in the future do differently. So if we think about the character of Helen Huntingdon, resilient, determined, she has a strong moral character. She is showing courage in the face of severe adversity. She is trapped. This is the 19th century. She is in a marriage where essentially her husband owns her and everything she ever has owned. So he has the ultimate control. But although he has physical dominance, financial dominance, she still shows courage and fortitude quietly, silently, meticulously. She is strategic in her planning because she knows essentially in order to protect her son from these awful influences that her husband exposes him to, she is going to need to be very clever about escape. And to do that, at points, she has to create a distance between who she really appears to be and who she really is. So although she's an artist, a painter, she has to be seen to be adopting this life, relinquishing this independence and adopting this life, this facade of a wife that will do everything, be continually available and judge not, which is very demanding because in that situation you would want to shout and scream. How can you do this? Why are you doing this to me? You're nothing but a disgrace. But she understands that won't change anything. In fact, it's just going to feed that fire because Arthur Huntingdon is a character who lives for the antagonism. So it's just going to make him worse. So let's just look at a quote from Helen Huntingdon, chapter 3. I would not send, she says, speaking about children, a poor girl into the world unarmed against her foes and ignorant of the snares that beset her path. Nor would I watch and guard her till, deprived of self-respect and self-reliance, she lost the power or the will to watch and guard herself. Now you might say, well, why did Helen voluntarily jump into bed with somebody who was so anti everything she stood for in the first place? And what Bronte does is set her up as somebody who doesn't have a mother figure in her life apart from her aunt. And although her aunt advises her, there's not that strong connection or attachment there. She is, in the beginning of the story, quite independent, has been forced to be by losing her mother. So she doesn't have the best start. And she seems to be torn between this idea of who she is and what Arthur Huntington represents, which is something, in the beginning, he's very charming, something that is the antithesis of all these older male gents that her aunt keeps trying to set her up with. She doesn't want to be married to someone with whom she can't express herself or be independent, and she believes in the beginning Arthur to be the answer to that, of course. Turns out to be quite the opposite very early on. But what this quote is saying is it's better to strengthen one's own hero than to weaken an opponent. And the quote goes like this: I only say it's better to arm and strengthen your hero than to disarm and enfeeble the foe. The hero here being yourself. She's saying it's better to strengthen yourself than to disarm your enemy. Why is that the case? She says, if you were to rear an oak sapling in a hothouse, tending to it carefully night and day and shielding it from every breath of wind, you could not expect it to become a hardy tree. But if it's grown up on the mountainside, exposed to the action of the elements and not sheltered from the shock of the tempest, it will become stronger. So she's saying we must strengthen ourselves. We must arm ourselves over disarming others. And to go back to the Stoic philosophy, we are talking about the empowerment of ourselves, the protection of our inner citadel. So, of course, it makes sense to relate this to Stoicism, because that's what Stoicism embodies. This idea that there's nothing really I can do about my enemies. I can't, they're external to my circle of control. So whatever they're going to do, I have no power over. So all I have to do is arm and strengthen myself in order to be able to batten down the hatches, build up the walls high, close the drawbridge in order to be able to protect myself. And this is what Helen Huntington does so well. We need to focus on building our own character, our own abilities. So we're saying that if we are shielding ourselves by growing, obviously this great symbol of the oak sapling, growing in a hothouse, protected against the elements. If we sit here and say, there are so many external forces attacking me all the time, and I just need to be protective. I can just sit in my hothouse and not go out into the world or experience everything. I'll be safe. Would that be the answer? And what she's saying is no. Actually, we need to be aware of the external forces, but we need to be strong enough to combat them, to stop them getting in. And this is the beauty of this novel. A last quote. My heart is too thoroughly dried to be broken in a hurry, and I mean to live as long as I can. She's hardened herself quietly, but she said, this is temporary. I'm doing this for the moment, for this situation. You may think it all very fine, Mr. Huntingdon, to amuse yourself with rousing my jealousy, but take care you don't rouse my hate instead. And when you have once extinguished my love, you will find it no easy matter to kindle it again. She understands early on that once love is lost, it cannot be regained. I have principles, and I understand that once you've crossed the line, that's it. She is creating boundaries from early on, and she is stating who she is. She's very well aware of who she is. The more that happens to her, the more she internally rails against it. So again, when did you act when it would have been more pertinent to stay quiet? The journal task. Think about a time when you were pushed to the limit, when there was really no way out and you felt cornered, and you just let rip. And then with quiet reflection, because obviously there's a lot of pause now, there's a lot of space between now and when that happened. In your journal, think about what you could have done differently. Again, the quote for the day: the moment we accept we're the problem, we accept we are the solution.